7. Pre-fascist and fascist vitalism. Vitalism itself rapidly passed beyond the existentialist episode we have just portrayed and applied itself to a more vitalism in imperialist Germany. 5-3. Overt, belligerent preparation for the impending barbaric reaction. Herein lies the significance of the philosophy of Ludwig Lukacs. As a writer he had already appeared in the pre-war period. Originally a leading member of the Stefan Georg circle, he then separated from it and went his own way. It was he who actually transformed vitalism into an open combat against reason and culture. With Lukacs, vitalism's anthropological side emerges still more distinctly than it did with his predecessors. A major part of his literary activity was based on this subject, on the argumentation of the new science of characterology. Here all objective knowledge in the theory of types has already dissolved completely. With Dilthey, anthropological typology had still been subservient to objective scientific thinking, while with Jaspers it already took precedence over the latter. With Lukacs, it signified a frontal attack upon the scientific spirit, upon the role which reason, knowledge and the mind played and continue to play in the collective development of mankind. Lukacs' basic conception was extremely simple. There is a universal cosmic life in which men, at the start of their evolution, participated as by a law of nature. Wherever there is a living body there is also soul, wherever there is soul, there is also a living body. The soul is the meaning of the body, and the image of the body the manifestation of the soul. Whatever is manifest has a meaning, and every meaning reveals itself as it becomes manifest. The meaning is experienced inwardly, the manifestation outwardly. The first must become image if it is to communicate itself, and the image must be internalized again in order to take effect. Those are literally the two poles of reality. 116 This cosmic nature-ruled, organic and alive state is suppressed and disrupted by the intellect. The law of 524. The destruction of reason. Intellect secedes from the rhythm of cosmic life. 117 The substance of human history is that intellect may elevate itself above the soul, comprehending wakefulness may be raised above the dream, arid and activity aimed at staying put above life, coming into being and expiring. 118 How this mighty reversal has taken place, nobody knows, but it is a fact. The extra-mundane power burst into the sphere of life. 119 But if how the intellect has gained dominance is unknown, its effect is fully evident to Lukacs, the killing of life. 120 Lukacs' whole philosophy is only a variation on this one primitive idea. His significance lies in the fact that never before had reason been challenged so openly and radically. He called its activity a scandal. 121 and an outrage. 122 The thirst for knowledge was equated with vulgar curiosity. On one occasion Lukacs described the youth who, as legend has it, wanted to remove the veil from the image of Zeus. Why does the youth really wish to lift the veil? From scientific interest or, to put it plainly, from curiosity. There is no essential difference between scientific and ordinary curiosity. The first, like the second, stems from a disquieting of the understanding, which is disquieted by everything that it does not yet possess. The urge to perceive is an urge to appropriate. Whatever the intellect takes possession of is invariably stripped of magic and destroyed in the process, if it was, in essence, a mystery. 123 And precisely therein, to Lukacs' mind, lay the scandalous nature of all scientific thinking, for what was philosophically essential was by no means a perception, but only a knowing about secrets. 124 Only through maintaining this respect towards the secret was an alive relationship to life possible. Clearly the category of life thus loses, with Lukacs, any relation to biology. He openly stated that biology was ignorant of wherein the aliveness of living things consists. L25 It is characteristic that Lukacs, like all his fellow vitalists, claimed to be setting himself above the antithesis of idealism and vitalism in imperialist Germany. 525 Materialism. For the apparent antithesis of being and consciousness obscured, in Lukacs' opinion, what is neither cogito nor res, neither spirit nor matter, but more important than either for temporal entities, namely life. The mind perceives that being is, but only life lives. This view of life was the acme of vitalistic irrationalism so far. Here, however, it no longer constituted a simple nihilistic negation, but an about turn into direct myth. Lukacs put forward an epistemology of his new doctrine of myths, playing off image against thing. The thing is a dead product of the mind, the image an animated manifestation. It was to this contrast that Lukacs linked his epistemology, which, in turn, became characteristic of and important to vitalism in its myth-creating phase, although it was, in itself, pure sophistry. That is, Lukacs accepted for the world of the intellect the epistemology of the neo-Kantians and positivists in order to confront it, in the world of the soul, with a demagogic, pseudo-materialist view of subject and object. He stated, the image has a reality independent of consciousness, the thing is thought into the world of consciousness and exists only for an inwardness of personal entities. As we know, the independence of the material world forms the basis of the epistemology of philosophical materialism. It is typical that Lukacs professed to be advocating it precisely when dealing with the most subjective issues, with products of fantasy. But this very sophistry is characteristic of the pseudo-objectivism of the vitalistic doctrine of myths. This epistemology of vitalism with a mythical slant nature ally had its own time theory, a discovery of real time which differed from that of the world of understanding as radically as in Bergson or Heidegger. But here Lukacs' polemics were directed against the future, which was not a property of real time. Only, Promethean mankind raised what was to come to the same stage of reality as the past. The Heraclitean man of world history toppled and is toppling the reality of what has been with the mirage of the future. Is shattering. 526. The destruction of reason. The fruitful connection of the near and the far so as to substitute for it the presence of Eris-like fascination with that distant phantom called the future. 128 Real time, on the other hand, was a stream coursing from the future into the past. 129 Thus in Clockers 2 we behold a struggle against the reality of a world history which is presented as an outrage perpetrated by intellect and reason, and whose most disreputable feature is that it ventures to set objectives for the future, thereby disturbing a soul snugly embedded in myth. In the preeminence of what has gone before, it is perhaps superfluous to stress that Clockers' time theory and the view of history closely linked to it stem from the same social need of the imperialistic bourgeoisie, the need to challenge socialism, as the corresponding doctrines of Spengler or Heidegger. Objectively, the degree of divergence is unimportant, since in each case the real connections of objective reality were turned resolutely upside down. All of them simply mark various stages of German irrationalism on the road to Hitler. Thus there came into being an empty, barren, soulless, discredited world. Although incapable of defending itself against the incursions of the intellect, the world of myth was deemed to reign over the world of ruling reason in a darkly fateful way. In everything from the fall of Rome to the prophesied collapse of the present-day states, Clockers saw this act of revenge by the downtrodden powers of myth. The only task his philosophy could set mankind was self-liberation from the infamous world of the intellect, to save the soul. 130 In Clockers we already discern in a very marked form the new vitalistic phase. On the one hand, vitalism has now become the overtly militant enemy to reason in a manner quite different from that of the thinkers discussed earlier. On the other hand, Clockers was, if we disregard the Spengler episode, the first thinker since Nietzsche in whose works vitalism was overtly creating concrete myths. Hence he became a direct forerunner of the National Socialist world. Vitalism in imperialist Germany. 527. View, a fact which that movement's official philosophy always gratefully acknowledged. Granted, it did so with certain reservations. For, in the first place, although Clockers was a militant vitalist, he still took hold of political individualism as his basis. His only territory could be the coffeehouse or drawing room. He could not possibly carry the battle onto the streets. In the second place, and above all, Clockers regarded war as another of the pernicious, culture-sapping consequences of the intellect. That was, of course, a point at which all National Socialist piety towards the meritorious forerunner had to cease. His fascist admirers criticized this pacifism and individualism in Clockers' thought. In its transition to fascism, vitalism also produced several militant thinkers who interpreted the antithesis of life and death in social and political terms, and in whose writings the effort to destroy reason acquired a social accent. This phase of vitalism arose largely on the basis of those small groups and alliances which had proliferated in the second half of the 20s. Their socio political aims oscillated between a sometimes sincerely felt sympathy with socialism and an outlook very close indeed to National Socialism, mostly, to be sure, with a marked preponderance of the latter trend. Of the authors producing fairly copious works in this vein, let us quote here just one particularly salient, sharply right-oriented representative, Ernst Jünger. As a young man, Jünger took part in the First World War, and he subsequently depicted the horrors of the war machinery in effective, by no means worthless stories. He always treated this subject in connection with the edifying experience of the front which, in the opinion of the militant younger generation of vitalists, formed the inner basis of the future renewal of Germany. The association of mechanized warfare and battlefront experience made Jünger one of the first propagandists for total mobilization. This proposition modified the content of the antithesis between the alive and the rigid. Because they approved of modern warfare, writers of Jünger's kind had to refrain from. 528. The destruction of reason. Rejecting all manifestations of modern capitalism as moribund, as dead shell after the manner of Heidegger, J. Aspers and Clockers, who all took the same line on this issue. With Jünger, the dividing line between death and life ran between the pacifist Italo-bourgeois capitalism of the Weimar Republic and the envisaged revival of an aggressive, Prusso-Germanic imperialism. It was here that the introduction of social demagogy and the incorporation of the word DNG class into these imperialist projects began. War literature of the sort published by Schiller and Sombart, and above all Spengler's Prussianism and socialism, had anticipated this new synthesis. But Jünger was the first to interpret the antithesis of proletariat and bourgeoisie vitalistically, so as to obtain the requisite broad social basis for the longed-for new imperialistic war, seen as liberating life from the dead bourgeois world. Thereupon vitalistic irrationalism quite openly took up its reactionary historical mission, the direct combating of Marxism-Leninism and the world outlook of the proletariat. We now find things openly stated which, in the case of the earlier proponents of vitalism, had to be shown by first deciphering convoluted, obscure and seemingly irrelevant theories. At the same time, this, to be sure, we already find in Spengler. It turns out that for all its openness and frontality, this struggle was an indirect and demagogic one. Spengler and Jünger do not even attempt, as did the early or pre-imperialistic apologists, to prove the superiority of capitalism over socialism. Instead they play off against real socialism and monopoly capitalism, which they dub socialism and present as the social system of the future. But in so doing Spengler still ignored the proletariat, whereas Jünger, like Hitler, was already making demagogic statements in proletariat's name. J. Linker summarized this philosophy in a programmatic book entitled The Worker, Government and Form. Form had already been one of the central categories of vitalism for a long time. Remember Spengler's morphology. Here it emerged as a vitalism in imperialist Germany. 529. Central concept of the myth-creating tendency. According to Jünger, the very methodology proceeding from the forms was revolutionary. The beholding of forms is a revolutionary act inasmuch as it perceives a being in the whole and unitary fullness of its life. It is the great advantage of this process that it takes place beyond the moral and aesthetic as well as the scientific law. 131 Here, needless to say, revolution is to be understood in the fascist sense, as a destroying of democratic parliamentary forms of government, in a manner demagogically professing to overcome bourgeois society along with those forms and in them. Junger's militant vitalism repudiated mind and reason just as radically as did Lukacs', but the mood and tone had changed completely. Morality and the philosophy of history now turned into politics. Junger wrote not of outrage and scandal, but of the high treason of the intellect. 132 With Junger, vitalism's radical subjectivism too was further heightened and given a politico-historical slant. Of the origin of myth he wrote, the victor creates the historical myth. 133 This cynically open statement marked the climax of the repudiation of all historical objectivity. The basic philosophico historical idea behind this new, militant phase of vitalism was fairly simple and primitive. The form of the worker, from which every trace of economics and social class has been carefully removed, represents the elemental force in contemporary culture, the life that force, as opposed to the bourgeoisie, which has never had any notion of its presence. This new conception, as we have indicated, carried on specific tendencies from Spengler's Prussian socialism, but we must point out the difference as well. Spengler undertook a straightforward identification. Junger saw in Prussianism a restraining of the elemental and went on to state, working life does not exclude the elemental, it includes it. 134 This was a vitalistic rationale of irrationalistic social demagogy. The dead bourgeois world is a world of security. This vitalistic demagogic critique of bourgeois culture was. 530 The destruction of reason. Of the greatest importance to the philosophical argumentation of fascism. In contrast to other reactionary movements which preached a return to earlier, secure, restrained eras, fascist agitation proceeded from the crisis itself and the dissolution of all secure conditions. And since it planned to set up a totally arbitrary government internally, its chief object being to organize the imperialistic war of aggression, it was driving towards this militant nihilism and a deliberate undermining of all secure conditions in the existence of the individual. Hence the ideology of security, a moribund bourgeois concept, was to be rendered contemptible at all costs. Fascism planned to rear the type of a brutal bully boy, deterred by nothing and stopping at nothing. Now since security was a category of German classical humanism, we begin to understand the leading fascist ideologists' hostility to this entire period. I let us mention in passing that the existential thinking of Heidegger and Jaspers contributed much, in its own ways, to the undermining of security. The two forms, that of the worker and the bourgeois, confronted each other in total mutual exclusiveness. The worker stood for an absolute otherness from the bourgeois citizen. This is where Junger's radically anti-historical, mythicizing view of history, a complete tearing asunder of history, commences. A form is, and no development can add to or detract from it. Hence evolutionary history is not a history of form. That evolution knows beginning and end, birth and death, from which the form is removed. History does not produce any forms, but changes along with the form. History is that tradition which a victorious power bestows on itself. 135 And that is tantamount to abolishing history. Originally, with Dilthey and Simmel, vitalism had proceeded to safeguard the independence of history in the face of the laws of nature. Even then, to be sure, and despite the ally with Dilthey, it showed a secondary tendency to obtain a foothold against historical relativism by means of an vitalism in imperialist Germany. 531 Anthropological reasoning. With Dilthey, as we have noted, this led to an antinomy of the anthropological and historical viewpoints. The need for a world outlook, the necessity of the outlook expressible through vitalism meant expending more and more energy on turning history into a myth, the more so the greater the pretension to concreteness. Only the forms of vitalistic anthropology and typology, inflated into entities, could inhabit the resultant myths. The more evolution advanced, the more real history lost any significance for the proponents of vitalism. With Spengler, real history was supplanted by the myths. With Heidegger, it sank into unauthenticity. With Lukacs, it was presented as a set of parables on the fall of man resulting from the dominance of reason and the infamous intellect. Much as all these conceptions may have differed, they had in common the feature that the historical process upheld the spurious movement of a number of types. And the more militantly reactionary these myths became, and the more directly they anticipated the fascist myth, the more strongly they polarized into adversaries. And the more the whole mysticized history of life served to illustrate the sole right to life of the one form and the total reprehensibility of the other. With Junger, this line was taken to the farthest stage possible in pre-fascist times. From here to Rosenberg it was only the shortest of steps. Thus the form of the worker determined the myth of the contemporary world. This world was a workshop landscape and, as far as the bourgeois world was concerned, a museum. It would fully become a workshop landscape only with the victory of the worker form, and at that point it would be converted into a battleground landscape, into imperial space or territory. 136 In Junger, the myth of the worker was a belligerently aggressive imperialist myth. As we see, vitalism in militant dress was now already only a few steps away from National Socialist philosophy. What? 532 The destruction of reason. Kept them apart was, basically, only the sectarian streak in the philosophy of J. Linker and thinkers like him. Inwardly they had already made up their minds to carry vitalism out of the scholar's study and intellectual coteries onto the streets, for their ideas were already tending to have a distinctly political character. But their methodology and terminology were still steeped in the esoteric wisdom of tiny closed, interlocking groups. The philosophical representatives of National Socialism took over the legacy of this whole irrationalistic development of vitalism in the imperialistic period, above all in its final phase. They used it to build ideological bridges between Hitlerian propaganda, which could never stoop too low, and the German intelligentsia raised on vitalism. By speaking the intellectual's language, this was both externally and intrinsically the case. They enticed them into the camp of National Socialism, or at least rendered them benevolently neutral in their attitude to it. Thus National Socialist propaganda had a circulation of varying range. Rosenberg stood more or less midway between Hitler and the official Nazi thinkers in the narrower sense. Ideologists such as Bauer and Krieg These two, whom we may regard as representative of official National Socialist thinking, incorporated Younger's idea of total mobilization in their fascistic completion of vitalism. Both of them continued its demagogic polemics against bourgeois life, the bourgeois age and culture. It is significant that, since these writings were not addressed to workers, Baumler and Kriek, in line with the traditions of bourgeois philosophy and sociology, largely confined themselves to cultural criticism. They had little to say of socialism, even in terms of the demagogic agitation of Hitler and Rosenberg. Baumler posed the task of a general, debourgeoisifying only in a very general way. While he depreciated bourgeois culture and poured contempt on it, he did so chiefly in his pursuit of a general militarization. Intellectuals were to be educated for the life of political soldiers. Baumler painted Vitalism in Imperialist Germany. 533. The misfortune of 19th century German history as follows. The really fateful aspect of the 19th century was the discrepancy between humanistic thinking and the tacit thinking of the soldiers of the Prussian militia. 137. In another passage, he saw in the fact that Nietzsche and Bismarck could not agree a symptom of incorrect development when the bourgeois class was predominant. 138. In this, Baumler was very close to Spengler's idea of PR. Usian socialism, amended by Younger. He now wanted to emphasize what was specific to and new about National Socialism and divorce himself from the older reactionary trends. Hence he criticized the old militarism in the sense that this was heroism with a bad conscience. Germany was militaristic before the war because it was not heroic enough. All in all, a military man was a soldier degraded to a civilian, and militarism held sway only where the civilian determined the spirit of the army. However, and here vitalism came in, with a virile people the soldier's life represents a life form. 139. The ideal of the political soldier, the S.A. and S. Man, was therefore life incarnate, in contrast to the fossilized bourgeois world. Thus we encounter once more the antithesis of alive and dead. Dead was the bourgeois world of urbanity and sacrality with all its social and cultural categories like economy and society, secure living, pleasure and the inner life. Dead was its thinking, both that of classical humanism and that of positivism, since it lacked intuitions and daring and was therefore soulless, despite all the inwardness. 140. With its sharp attacks on everything that it called bourgeois culture, militant fascist vitalism proudly declared an allegiance to irrationalistic nihilism and agnosticism, albeit in a language which appeared to give them a mythical, positive element. This mythical element now became the core of the epistemology of the new Vitalistic stage. The fascist thinker Bohm stated, "For Germano, the uninvestigable is not a limiting condition but an eminently positive one. It permeates our entire reality and governs all things." 534. The destruction of reason. Great and small. An insoluble part of the fabric of our reality, the uninvestigable is essentially inaccessible but not at all unfamiliar. We are acquainted with it even though it cannot be voiced. It operates in our life, determines our decisions, has control over us. It cannot be said what profundity is, but it can be demonstrated through men in whom it exists. 141. Here it is patent that the Vitalistic argumentation of that which is alive and German represents nothing other than a base for Hitler's boundless arbitrariness. As Führer, the relation of myth to history Baumler defined in the same spirit as Bohm. The problem of myth will remain hopeless as long as one clings to the question of how myth has come into being. For then one is presupposing a fixed basis to human evolution and proceeds to ask how myth must have arisen within history. A satisfying answer can never be offered to this question because the formulation is wrong. Myth is downright unhistorical. Myth reaches down not only into prehistory but also into the primal grounds of the human soul. 142. Causality, from the lofty angle of this mystical insight into the uninvestigable and primal grounds, was contemptuously dismissed as a category of absolute security. We already know from J.I. Anger the social basis of this disparagement of security. For the National Socialist philosophers in the narrower sense, the struggle against law and causality as expressions of security also tended to portray the complete internal arbitrariness of the Hitler regime as philosophically higher, closer to life and the Germanic soul than the defeated bourgeois world order. So the antithesis of life and death cropped up in every domain, and it now signified the contrast to war and peace, of German and un-German, of National Socialist and bourgeois. And thus the basic categories of vitalism were so reshaped as to lay a foundation for the slogans and deeds of the National Socialist revolution. The nihilism of late vitalism became the basis for fascist, heroic realism. Vitalism in Imperialist Germany. 535. For, precisely in the spirit of Kierkegaard's modern followers, Baumler too regarded life as signifying decision. Action on the basis of the National Socialist outlook had to be irrational and unarguable in principle. Action, Baumler stated, is not however a realizing of recognized values. A truly active man always finds himself in uncertainty. He is devoid of knowledge, as Nietzsche puts it. It is precisely the hallmark of action that no value covers it. The man of action lays himself open. His share is never securitas but certitudo. 143. But whereas nihilism was the consequence of the Kierkegaardian position, logically so with Heidegger and somewhat reconditely with J. Aspers, Baumler cut the Gordian knot very simply by confronting the biological life concept with life as a cosmic fact. While the former would certainly lead to relativism, the latter would resist all relativizing. 144. Here again we notice how fascist vitalism took previous tendencies to their conclusion and exacerbated them. We have been able to observe the gradual, ever stronger separation of the Vitalistic life concept from that of biology. Here there is already a strict antithesis which is energetically expressed not only by Baumler, but also by Kriek and others. In Kriek's view the theses of biology, like those of other sciences, were only parts of the myth. 145 Even the chief categories of orthodox fascism, race and blood, he interpreted as symbols only. 146 Hence it was only logical to present the new science of life as follows. Universal biology is perfected in man's image of himself. The image is described through a racial popular political anthropology. This anthropology replaces the exhausted philosophy. 147 Here we can clearly see whither the final consequences of that anthropological principle timidly, hesitatingly introduced by Dilthey were bound to lead, and how fascist vitalism solved what it found to be the insoluble dilemma of anthropologism in philosophy. This brings us to the concrete explanation of what cosmic 536 The destruction of reason. Life signifies. The Moore spoke with scorn of the imageless idealism of German classicism, and he added by way of a contrast, an expression of the philosophically positive. Hitler is not less than the idea, he is more than the idea, for he is real. 148 Creek gave an extremely clear picture of how this reality of life is manifested. Destiny demands the heroic man of honor who is receptive to every order. 149 The order was, of course, to come from the Führer. The personality of the preordained Führer is the arena in which the fate of the whole is decided. 150 What the Führer and what the National Socialist movement wanted was nothing else than a religious revelation. Krieg vigorously defended the notion that such a revelation was possible even today. But God speaks within us directly as the people setting out to battle. 151 Thus all the antinomies of vitalism, as nihilistic relativism were resolved in the National Socialist myth. Every question was solved through obedience to Hitler's orders. Following these orders meant eliminating the antithesis of the mere theorist and the alive man, interested and active in Kierkegaard's sense. More clearly stated what leadership meant in practice for the new period of political soldiering, a college of education which does not speak of leadership through Adolf Hitler and Horst Wessel is unpolitical. 152 Which is to say unalive, bourgeois, reprehensible. And Krieg supplemented this proclamation of leadership through mind and idea with the lucid comment, he who wishes to devise his own answer is assuredly good for nothing, the predestined course of events will sweep him aside as a useless hindrance and cast him on the dung heap. TS3 In this way vitalism merged with fascist demagogy. It does not matter how far Bauer, Krieg and company were really drawing logical conclusions, and how far cynically complying with that power of brutal exploitation and suppression whose coming they foresaw. From the objective philosophical viewpoint, they drew the ultimate conclusions. Vitalism in imperialist Germany. 537 Vitalism and completed that journey which began with Nietzsche and Dilthey on the eve of the imperialistic era, a journey whose fitful progress we have traced in its most important stages. That thinkers such as Dilthey and Simmel would have recoiled in horror from the fascist reality and would have deeply despised its so-called philosophy is certain, but this does not diminish the objective historical connection. In the substance of his writing, Spengler was far closer to fascism than they were but still found himself in continual dispute with its official representatives. And Stefan Georg, whose school played a major part in the dissemination of vitalism, while individual poems of his contain and herald the prophetic foreboding of the Führer, so that his influence certainly carried in this direction, even died in voluntary exile. That, however, does not at all affect the fact that the Bauer Krieg Rosenberg philosophy would not have been possible without Spengler, and that Spengler's would not have been possible without Dilthey and Simmel. Hitler himself was far too uneducated and cynically lacking in convictions to see in any philosophy something more than an instantly effective means of agitation. But it is patent that even his views were formed under the influence of the same destructive and parasitical imperialistic trends which gave rise to vitalism among the intellectual elite. A nihilistic lack of convictions and a faith in miracles as related polarities also determined the particular nature of Hitlerian propaganda. In Hitler himself, to be sure, cynical nihilism had the upper hand. Indeed, as we know from the conversations with Rauschning, Hitler regarded even racial theory as a hoax but ruthlessly exploited it for his predatory imperialistic ends. 154 The general atmosphere surrounding his agitation was a popular, vulgar version of the basic tendencies of vitalism. In his propaganda he rejected any conviction governed by the understanding and was only concerned to produce and maintain a frenzy. 155 Agitation, to him, was merely a working on man's freedom of will. 156 For all that. 538 The destruction of reason. The technique derived from the American advertising world, Hitler's agitation stemmed just as much, in content, from the same soil as vitalism. The influence of vitalism could be seen more directly in Rosenberg. Admittedly, even with him, a cynical lack of convictions was quite blatantly the overriding factor, with the slight difference that as a pupil of the Russian White Guard and a student of Merezhkovsky and other decadent reactionaries, Rosenberg was already predisposed by training to a receptiveness to German vitalism. Thus his book The Myth of the 20th Century was a crudely propagandistic vulgarization of the final period of vitalism. With Rosenberg too we find a mythical history without historical substance, a repudiation of world history that was intended to prove the absolute preeminence of the Germans in the world. With him too we find that the antithesis of life and death, of intuition and reason has acquired a brutally militant slant. With him too, a vehemently demagogic attack upon the intellect and science was one of the central points of the new myth, as rationale. Here the antithesis of life and death was presented as one of Germans and Jews, of productive and grasping capitalists, etc. That aristocratic epistemology which Dilthey had reinforced became the mythical infallibility of the Führer. Spengler's theory of cultural cycles, that sociological solipsism, was presented as a doctrine of the perennial nature of sharply divided races which could associate with one another only in the form of mutual destruction. The Vitalistic doctrine of types was presented as a call for the creation of types, as a rule of the ruffians of the S. A and SS philosophically, there was no longer anything new in all this, even if measured by the philosophical level of vitalism's final phases. The vitalism of Rosenberg was just a powerful tool for the crimes of the fresh imperialistic world war and of its preliminaries, but it is not without significance that vitalism in imperialist Germany. 539. Vitalism was concluded in exactly this fashion, or that the National Socialist philosophy sprang from these roots. For this barbaric cul-de-sac thereupon appears a necessary climax to the self-dissolution of German imperialistic ideology and vitalism, whose earliest philosophical forerunners we trace to the irrational reaction of German feudal absolutism to the French Revolution. And this climax was by no means fortuitous, but the merited fate of the imminent tendencies of vitalism itself. Hegel, who came to vitalism when it was not yet far advanced, when it was a doctrine of direct knowing, prophetically wrote of it, from the thesis that direct knowing must be the criterion of truth it follows. That call superstition and idolatry are declared to be true, and that the most wrongful and indecent content of the will is justified. That natural desires and inclinations automatically deposit their interests in the consciousness, and the immoral purposes are directly located in the same. 157. Notes. 1 tilde, collected works.